welcome to the show again. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Um, a little bit of your background. Over the last decade, you worked in a range of startups, in
hmm
technology, in health, in consumer products. Well woven, we worked together for a couple years at Medley Health in Oak Street. I'm super excited to talk to you about people and culture, our personal experience in our field. I've enjoyed working with you and as a friend, and also working together with you over these last few years, and looking forward
Likewise.
to talking about people and culture today.
Sure. I'm excited. Two things that I would be a fool to not be passionate about, because then I would just be torturing myself for the last 10 years of my career and whatever comes afterwards. So awesome. I'm happy to chat about it.
Awesome, brother. Thank you again.
Sure. I think to back up and even start before, I would say we are living through, I'm going to make this sound much more interesting than it is, but we are living through a revolution in the HR space where, in general, if you went back 30, 40 years, not even 20 years, human resources really meant the personnel department, right? It was where you went when you first joined a company to fill out your paperwork and if you were in trouble and when you were leaving. There were occasional moments where HR would be involved, trainings and sometimes recruitment, although that was often outsourced. But for the most part, it was a compliance, I would say, reactive sort of a field. And that's not
It's
to say
kind of
anything
confusing.
negative, by the way.
Yeah.
Not
Uh,
not to say anything negative about the people who were working in it at that point, because I think they are part of the reason that the field has changed. But over the last few decades, HR, which encompasses so many different things that are often unrelated, like benefits and recruiting and
mhm.
training and executive coaching. These are all very, very different skill sets. It's become more of a strategic partnership within the organization. I would say almost a team of internal consultants, or often one internal consultant who still is responsible for all of these aforementioned compliance measures, but the meat of the interesting part of the field is finding ways to build culture, or not just build culture, but define the culture of
Mhm.
an organization and to find ways to basically, at its core, make the employer brand of the company that is the appeal for why somebody would want to work for you, not just because of what you do, but the environment and the types of people that they would be working with if they were to join, to keep them engaged, which often means developing them, finding ways to reward, and not just in terms of annual merit increases, but in other more creative ways as well, to reward people for putting in more discretionary effort and for helping to grow the business beyond their job description.
Let's pause for a quick
And
sec there.
yep,
You're hitting on some good points. So the traditional HR is this compliance function you mentioned, and today it's
yeah,
it's sort of shifting to enablement. It's about enabling the company's internal sort of brand, or it's creating a brand for the company, but it's also these inner workings of the company. It's the how we get work done and what we believe and how our
right.
approach, our unique approach as a company. That's kind of where I hear you were going with that. The compliance, I think there's still big companies need compliance, right? Like if
Yep.
you're Costco, you need an HR where you have retail stores, you need somewhere to go to if there's so that function exists. But that's always been something I should say that's been kind of been confusing over the last few years trying to understand this topic. Um,
hmm
it's been confusing to understand, and as you did well describe it, there is this evolution happening of going from compliance to enablement, or would you use that word, or it's
That's a
how?
component of it. I would say making the company more efficient, which a lot of teams do, but from an HR perspective, it's by making people, essentially in the simplest boiled down fashion, fostering an environment that people want to work in,
Hmm.
right? I think in the same way, and I've mostly worked in the tech space, although like with well-woven consumer goods and a few other different types of companies. But in the tech space, you have product teams that look for ways to make a product appealing to people, and you have customer service teams that listen to the customer and find ways, in addition to resolving problems, find ways to make that product more appealing as it evolves. And I think HR is very, very similar. If that product is the working experience that people have, we're the product team and the customer service team in terms of iterating and finding ways to make that more appealing to our internal customers, which are employees.
Hmm.
If that
Cool.
makes sense.
Yeah. So let's talk about shaping a company's culture.
Mhm.
What are some of the strategies that have been proven effective for you? Maybe counterintuitive, like things that you don't think about that are effective, or maybe just in general. I'll leave it to you.
Yeah. I would say two things come to mind. It's probably something I could talk about with you for hours, but the two main things, one, I think not enough can be said for something that people often poo-poo, which is the what's seen typically as the marketing or branding at the top level, the vision, the mission, and the values, which not all companies have, right? And the analogy that I always like to use is the vision is what the world looks like if the company is successful in its mission. The mission is what the company does, and then the values are the sort of behavioral guidelines. So it's kind of like your destination being the vision, the road being the mission, and then your values are your GPS. And I think with millennials and Gen Z in the workplace, more attention has been paid to these sorts of things because I think generationally you see that these demographics care more about these things. But sometimes a lot of companies push what I would call marketing of their culture more than they push practical cultures, right? They might have visions or missions or values that sound really good on paper,
Hmm. Hmm.
but when you try, you realize it is just paper. It's not something that really means anything. So I think on the one hand,
It's very easy to
finding a way.
produce. It's very easy to, it's fun to create marketing. It's very easy to produce these branding.
Right.
No, I shouldn't
It's
say
like,
easy, but it's
hmm?
in a sense it's easier to produce branding and marketing and sales pitch than just actually build a culture, or refine a culture.
Or to make it pragmatic, right? So in the same way that, for example, no company is going to say that they're against diversity now. Every company will say, which they should, we value a diverse, inclusive workspace. Great. How?
What does
Right?
that
How do
mean?
you do
Wait,
that? Is it just a statement? So I think on the one hand, making sure that you don't poo-poo the process of identifying what your vision, your mission, and your values are, and finding ways to make them actionable and pragmatic. For me, that has always meant taking the mission, vision, and values and then linking them into different things, like the way that you interview people or what you reward people for, whether it's sort of monthly recognition, which is more informal, or even performance evaluations, which happen throughout the year in a more formal setting. I think that's one aspect. I think the second aspect is inviting people to be a part of shaping the culture. And not everyone's going to be interested, so you shouldn't force people. But I think using the analogy I used before of, for example, product teams like HR, the employee experience is our product, and we can borrow a lot from how product teams function. Product teams sometimes have focus groups with customers to learn how they can improve their products. I think HR teams in partnership with leadership, and I'll asterisk that because HR should never just fully lead something without leadership being aligned and on board with them for a variety of reasons. But running groups with people who are interested and invited into the company to help shape and identify the culture. And I'm not saying give them full creative rights to that, because ultimately leadership does have to retain authority there, but inviting them to be part of the conversation, because even if it doesn't work out the way that they want to, and you'll never please everybody, when people feel like they've been involved in something, psychologically, that's called procedural justice. And it means that they're going to feel bought into it, regardless of the outcome, much more bought into it, generally speaking, than they would if we just defined it behind closed doors. And you might say, well, how many times are you defining your vision, your mission, and your values? What if somebody joins 5 years after that work is done? And my counterpoint to that would be it's an iterative process.
that's
Just how
key.
your products and your services
Yeah.
develop, your culture develops
Yep.
with the company as well. It
You,
grows, it
you
changes.
said something there that I think really resonates. It's an iterative process. It's evolving over time. We tend to We're a startup. I mean, we're a family-sized company. We're 10 years old. We aspire to be somewhere, but we are sort of this growing organization. So just describe there, what does that look like for small mom and pop, like small company, like the 0 to the employees or 0 to 20 employees, 20 to 100. You've been to those sort of environments. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
what comes to mind? Let's talk about that.
I think in some ways it's easier for smaller companies to do this because you have less viewpoints. Not that having more and more diverse viewpoints is a bad thing. It's actually a great thing, but it's easier to manage if you have 10 or 20 people or up to 50 people to involve in that shaping. And I do think in general, smaller companies also have organically, because everybody knows everybody, whether they're the CEO or the newest hire, they kind of have this natural culture that develops. The vision and the mission are almost sort of understood because of how small and unique the group of people is that's working together. And so in those types of companies, it's usually less ideating on what your culture is and more so kind of like therapy when a good therapist will walk a client through understanding or identifying things that they somehow know innately in their subconscious.
Hmm. Hmm.
A good organizational development consultant, in my opinion, will walk a company of that size through putting a name on and identifying the institutions and the morals and the values that they already have, but maybe have never sat down and said, we seem to value hospitality here. For example, I'll use well woven. When I was working with you, something that I loved and was always seen as a benefit to me was you would feed people all the time. There was always fresh, healthy snacks, coffee, lunch, dinner. It was something that was almost expected in a sense because it was something
Yeah.
that was happening all the time. But if you pause and you look at it, you could say, wow, we seem to really value hospitality at Well Woven, right? Right, that right there. That's one of your values. Making
Hmm.
everybody feel when they're in the office that they're not just in a sterile environment, but
Hmm.
they're somewhere where they're welcome
Hmm.
and almost like home. They're a guest and they're being fed and sort of taken care of.
Hmm.
For
Hmm.
example.
Cool. Culture, does that start at the top? Where does culture, I guess in a small environment, small business, there, like you said, there's less decision makers, there's things can be a little, communication can flow quicker. Everyone knows what everyone's up to. There's more efficiency in, or more speed, less latency in communication. Where does culture start in larger? Does it start with the top?
The short answer is yes, but there is always a comma but with all of these things. And I think so in the same way that you can argue that New York City has a distinct culture, right? But the Bronx, Brooklyn, different parts of Manhattan, Queens, they all have their own unique identities. I think different teams
What's
within an
Brooklyn?
organization.
What's Brooklyn? What's Bronx?
I would say
Brooklyn's
I could speak more to Brook
Italiano. Yeah, yeah.
I can speak more to
Brooklyn,
Brooklyn because I
Bay
used to
Ridge,
live there,
Brooklyn.
but
Depends
but
where in
now it has
Brooklyn.
that sort of hipster
Williamsburg.
music. Yeah, yeah. But
But if
even
you,
then, different neighborhoods. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. What's Bay Ridge? I had a cousin that lived in Bensonhurst. 90s, we would go there every holiday, Christmas, and yeah, it was very Italian. At that point, I think Italians were starting to move out of there, but it was a very distinct Italian American culture. Williamsburg right now is more modern, hip, hipster type vibe. But there's
Yes, I
subcultures
think
within cultures, and I guess to your point, like Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, it's, there's cultures and subcultures within those cultures. I guess,
I,
yeah.
I would agree, and I think the commonality is there's usually some sort of unifying core. So you could say New York is a city of diverse immigrants and their descendants who come to make a better living for themselves. There's a general sense of being fast paced and almost this kind of anonymity and respect for privacy that happens from having 10 million people squeezed within a relatively small space for that amount of people. But that's expressed differently in different neighborhoods, right? And I think similarly, to loop it back to your question, different teams and departments within an organization might have different ways that they work, and that's good. Diversity is not just what we tend to think it is as something being very visual and surface level. It's reflected in the way we work, our institutions, how different teams project manage things, and how they process disagreements. And that's very necessary. But the common DNA should be the vision and mission, right? Why are we all here? And that's one very strong management principle that I try to
Yeah.
teach managers if I'm ever in a position to do so, which is finding ways to link the work that individuals are doing on your team back to the mission of the company,
Hmm.
right? So if I'm training a recruiter, for example, at a company that has a SaaS product, they may never talk to a customer, but I can identify the fact that they are the gatekeeper for bringing in the best talent to innovate and create ideas that will develop and change the DNA and the fabric of that product, right? So finding ways to link back how the different aspects of culture might differ at the team to the federal level, meaning the vision or mission, which does, to an extent, come down from the top. Ultimately, it is executive leadership that defines what a company's purpose is, although I'm arguing or trying to make a point that involving if to the extent that you have the ability to do so, depending on the stage that the company's in,
Hmm.
involving your employees in that process is not a bad idea.
Indeed. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So it's
yeah.
mission, the vision, and those are the results that we need to achieve. So it's kind of tying it back to what do we need to achieve this quarter, this year, 10 years out? We need to grow a specific segment of the business, a specific product, a specific uh, revenue, a specific channel. That's something that this year, for the last year, have been more results oriented. Yeah, we have the
Mhm.
mission, we have the vision, but those are tied to tangibles in more of a sense. I think the specific business results, that's something that I've learned has to, the sharper that is, then it's essential. It's essential to have those to be tangible things. And I have not perfected this throughout the company, but we're in that mode this year of being more results oriented, reviewing the results, developing that within the culture of we are measured upon. We operate our DNA, hospitality, or but regardless, we need to achieve a result for the company. So it's kind of balancing both. It's having a focus, I guess, that near term, that long term focus. Yeah, man.
Similar,
Cool.
by the way, to an OKR framework for other business goals. I think
Yeah.
the mission, vision, values
Yep.
being incorporated is a form of
It's
OKRs in
100%
a certain
OKR.
sense.
That
Yeah.
that's exactly it.
Yeah.
That's probably
Yeah.
the best, most approachable, one of the best frameworks, or most common frameworks, to be able to organize what we're going to achieve in a specific window of time. How are we going to measure this? Um, as a manager, I guess how has that been in your career, like managing like OKRs within the HR world? Do you guys operate under, or how have you seen that in
Yes.
your over the course of your career?
Yes, we do operate under OKRs, at least in the organizations I've worked at. Even if you don't formally have an OKR framework, typically the way that you map projects is very, very similar and related. And I think I would say two things on this. One is that operationalizing HR, which is a common theme of this revolution I was talking about. I might be exaggerating by using that word, but I like it. Making HR more
Powerful.
strategic means taking the key OKRs to the company and finding ways to support that. For example, if one of the key objectives is regarding growth and revenue, well, we're going to be the team most likely responsible for screening and finding the talent connected to that. Another part, which I'm usually a very big fan of, and it relates to the cultural part of HR, is cultural surveying, right? Asking your employees to get quantitative data. What areas of their working experience are we doing well, and what areas are we not doing so well? And that will yield you, if you're using software like a Glint or a Culture Amp or a Lattice that sort of has these pre-created benchmark ready surveys, it'll enable you to have data and scores that you can compare against benchmarks for similar companies, and then set your goals, your key results within the OKR framework of, all right, we were low on, for example, psychological safety, which is usually defined as the sense that people have that if they speak up and share opinions that are seen as contrary to the norm or to what leadership prefers to hear, that they won't receive any sort of repercussive action for doing that. And that might be, let's say, at a 50 or a 40. And you might say, all right, well, by the next quarter, we want to take measures, institute certain initiatives to get that up to a 60 or a 70 or something along those lines. That's typically how I've seen OKRs implemented on the HR side of things.
Mhm. Awesome, Nolda. Thank you.
Of course.
All right, let's talk about work-life balance. What are some of the most common misconceptions people have about work-life balance? How can organizations better support their employees in this area? And
I
this is
think,
definitely, sorry to preface that with
sure.
like different company cultures have different sort of views on this. I think over the last few years, we've seen large organizations like Tesla's, Google's, pulling being a lot more efficient, bringing employees back into the office, uh, driving efficiency. For tech specifically, it's been a cycle of contraction of capital in the market. I'm not an expert in this, but I'm just kind of trying to synthesize what I've general trends. Yeah, things, some companies have tightened up. We're definitely in this trend of more efficiency. There is uncertainty with technology and AI making people more efficient. So yeah, let's come back. What are the common misconceptions about work-life balance. How do we companies today support their employees in this area?
The first one, which is becoming less common in my anecdotal experience, but I also think if there was longitudinal data on this, it would support what I'm about to say, or yes. So the first one is that it's not actually something that's important. I think there's this tendency in human psychology that if we experienced or we grew up in a rougher way, we think everybody should go through what we went through.
Hmm.
And so there are some people who still believe that work-life balance is this just sort of new millennial Gen Z thing, that really hard work and grit and being the first one in the office and the last one to leave, which I'm not saying is a bad thing, and I think is many times a good thing depending on what profession you're in and the individual needs for certain projects and timelines. But the idea that just working long hours in and of itself, regardless of context,
Yeah,
is
it's not a badge.
important.
Yeah,
It's not always a badge. And I think efficiency is one counterpoint to it. I think another counterpoint is I believe in using data whenever it's available. Study after study shows burnout is a real thing, and people plateau after they put in a certain amount of effort into a given project or in a given specific period of time, I should say, right? So I think understanding that we're like phones or laptops, we need to recharge. Or a better example would be cars. You could drive your car on an empty tank on fumes for a few miles. You're going to damage the engine, but ultimately you're going to make the car worse off in terms of how it drives in the future. And I think
we were just talking about cars, so it's a good.
we were in a context that I will not share on here. But yes, having
I have a counterpoint to that. Yeah.
Sure. But I would say, like, recognize your body and your mind are not, no matter how high your work tolerance is, they're not fueled by nuclear energy. It's not renewable.
Yeah.
You need to recharge after a while in order to be effective.
100%. I agree with that sentiment. I said counterpoint. I mean, additional point, like perspective to this. I think there's like the running example. Like we were talking about running up our first times running Williamsburg Bridge. There's this very subtle incline that you don't really feel. Your long legs, your your longer legs had the advantage on me. It was a struggle, and so I would get tired at that part of the run. But once you get through the first 10, 15 minutes, we get through that patch, and the second wind or your energy starts to kick and your body starts to realize like, hey, I'm running, I'm going to start kicking. This is really happening. And so there are these things in humans that once there's sort of limits, and you only are able to discover those limits until you've hit them. And sometimes you have to go past it a little bit, and you have to push yourself. There's no easy way to, if you're going to get to 3 miles from 2 miles, if you're not feeling up for it, don't push yourself the first day.
Sure.
Enjoy your run. Make sure you enjoy it every time. But if you want to get to that 3 mile goal, you're going to have to push yourself at a point when you're ready to push yourself. And there's cycles, there's energy. It's in longer runs. We did the one from Williamsburg to Brooklyn Bridge, which is, I think, like 7-8 miles. And there's peaks of that where you slow, you go faster. And so I think the same thing if you're in one company or in your career, there are these peaks, there are these periods where you need to conserve energy. You need to go slower to then speed back up. You need to get your sleep. You need to refuel your battery. So yeah, I think that's important. But back to the topic of work-life balance. What is that? Let's talk more about that. What else? What else comes to mind?
Well, I think to kind of integrate my next point with what you just said, I would say two things. One, you're absolutely correct. There are times when you can push your limits in terms of just exertion. And if we think back to when you and I used to run, that would often be once a week or once every 2 weeks. But if we did, 10-mile runs every day, we would have arthritis now. So I think that's part of the balance in and of itself, knowing that there are going to be some days where you really push yourself and some days where maybe you still do what you came there to do, but you don't go as hard as you did on the day that you're pushing yourself beyond your limits. I think another thing is when you run together, sometimes you might point out to me, you swing your arms too much. Maybe try to swing your arms a little bit less because you're expending too much energy.
Yeah,
Or I might say, hey, your shoes are great, but have you considered investing in a pair of shoes that forms to your feet in the way that you pronate or don't pronate? So it gives you a little bit more, I don't know, boost on the way that you run. And I think that could also be drawing back to work-life balance. I think that there's no shame in it's a bit of a trite statement at this point in time, but working smarter, not harder, and finding tools and ways that you can be more efficient without necessarily having to just kind of push yourself push yourself exertion wise for the merit of doing it. And the example that I like to give is if you hired a person to paint your house, and they told you, I can paint your house in 1 week for $3,000, or I can paint your house in 1 month, also for $3,000, and the quality will be exactly the same. You would choose, unless you really wanted to see the guy around your house because you needed some conversation, most people would choose the first one. That is often something, finding ways to be more efficient is often something that's industry dependent, right? Software engineers might have different tools than salesperson. However, I happen to have it on my desk. There are certain tools, some of which come in one of my favorite books, The 7 Habits of
Love
Highly
it.
Effective People.
All right.
Like the Eisenhower Matrix, which I know anyone who's worked with me for more than 4 months knows the Eisenhower Matrix.
Those tools are great.
Different tools.
Yeah, they're great ways to you look for efficiency. The framework for trying to batch, trying to sort of connect dots. And so it kind of comes to connecting dots and creating clarity, mental clarity. Like, what are the things I'm trying to get done in this work week? What can be most, how can I channel my energy to be most effective? And as I get older, in my career, I've realized, we do have energy levels, and there's, I'm a morning, some people are morning people, some people are more creative or more effective at later hours, but there are these sort of peak bands that we have. Some of that might be genetic, I'm not sure, but I think that we have to, it's finding your sort of cadence, and to each person, it's an individual sort of, a little individual. The example you made regarding running, just to jump to that, you mentioned like, hey, I might give you a suggestion on posture or sort of on your hands. And you mentioned like shoes. It's a team sport. Like I realize like working together is a team sport. And that kind of comes back to culture we were talking about. It's like, it's a team sport. And I'm not a big sports guy, and I grew up watching the Rangers after they won the Stanley Cup in 1994, and they're actually playing really, really well. They're in I think the third round of the playoffs. So I think after this, there's one more round, and they go to championship. But there is a team sport aspect to building. There's sports science or sport. There's a teamwork here. There's a sports play here. Help we get to the finish line together, and we're passing. That's something not always measured. We always tend to look at ourselves. I mean, we're talking about ourselves, but it's the energy that comes outside also can heavily impact our performance. What's my culture? What's my team's what's my team's sort of culture? That can play big time into our performance. Are there any pivotal moments in your career? Like you mentioned the Eisenhower Matrix. You have the Heimisms. There's this Heim sort of references. You go to the painter. You have
Trademark that.
you have a series of these profound sort of principles in your toolbox that you pull out. How did you tell me about sort of in your career? How did you come to sort of gather these? Are these things that I guess my question would be, were there any sort of pivotal moments in your career that have influenced your approach to HR, leadership, recruiting?
Two come to mind. Because of the virtue that most of my career has been in smaller startups that have scaled, I've had access to a lot of smart leaders because the organizations were very intimate in the beginning. And I borrowed a lot from HR leaders, but also CEOs and COOs, salespeople. Sales leaders always love to teach. they will, you never even have to ask. They'll just kind of, hey, let me teach you something. Let me teach you a lesson I learned a long time ago. And I borrowed a lot
I
from these
love that.
people. I borrowed a lot from reading and just sort of being interested and finding different sort of classes that I can involve myself in, especially within the field of organizational psychology. I've had the pleasure and the privilege in most of my roles of being either formally part of a team that could teach different seminars on management practices or interviewing techniques. And I do think that teaching is one of the best ways to learn something. Even if it's just presenting something that you're not practicing day in and day out, but teaching others about the theory behind it, it helps to reinforce what you learn. And more recently in my career, I'd say last 4 or 5 years, I've found ways, and this has been very helpful, to learn from, for example, customer service leaders and applying their principles and practices to how I manage employee relations, which I see as customer service internally. Or again, learning from product leaders, some very talented people I could think of that I've worked with, and their process for how they design things and how they make things appealing, and applying that to employee engagement and employee experience, or marketing and copywriters, something that we did at Wellwoken, and applying that to how you write an employee handbook and an employee self-design employee self-service. So it's appealing and it's not just this 80-page document that people read once, not really, and then sign. Um, so I think, and I don't think this is just HR specific, I think everybody should seek to learn and gain something from other verticals within the businesses they work in and see how we can adapt that to what they do.
Hmm. I
Um,
love that. No.
yeah,
There's something to learn and teach one another. I think that's like a great, that's sort of an anecdotal way to describe what you just said. I think I appreciate that a lot. The internal like customer service learning from the customer service leader for internal customer service. Have those been more indirect interactions, or have they been sort of, hey, can I schedule time with you to talk about this? Like, how have you approached it in the past? Or is it kind of like all of the above?
mostly direct interactions. When you're an HR leader, you come to the table oftentimes facing a bunch of stereotypes from employees who are, seen as, and I'm using air quotes because I don't see anyone this way, but closer to the chopping bowl, people who are more at the ground level. They tend to fear HR and they see HR as someone that you keep at arm's distance and have a very cold relationship with, because ultimately we're present when you might lose your job or get in trouble. And on the opposite side, the opposite extreme, senior leadership sometimes will see the stereotype of HR as just being this compliance part of the organization that doesn't generate revenue and doesn't really understand the business. And my way of combating that has been being very extroverted, or trying to be very extroverted, and building relationships with as many people as possible. And if you're in an organization where it's impossible to know everybody, well, then you find key leaders at the director to VP level, because your relationships with them may influence how you're perceived by the people who report into them.
Mhm.
So it was for a different reason that in every organization I've worked with, I've tried to, I don't want to say befriend, but build strong relationships and rapport beyond just sort of an official formal level with all the leaders that I work with. But by doing so, you get to know people, and eventually you express genuine, for me, usually it's genuine curiosity about what they do. And most people will teach you and open up, because we love to talk about things that we're good at. Uh,
Love that.
yeah,
Yeah. I've gotten to know you. You're a genuine, curious minds,
thank
inquisitive,
you.
and yeah, absolutely.
Appreciate that.
Let's talk about challenges. What's some of the biggest challenges you faced in building, maintaining organizational culture, or human resource, like operating human resources operations, in your recent career over the last couple of years? What
Two
comes to
come
mind?
to mind. I think one is, and this is always a challenge, and it's an enjoyable challenge typically, although some people make it more difficult than others to fight, and that is a lot of times you may come with really, really good ideas and know exactly what or have a, it's, I think it's arrogant to say no, because every organization is different. But you might have a strong inclination towards what an organization might benefit from. And there can occasionally be leaders who have very strong opinions about why that would not work either for their organization if they're at the CEO level. And I've been fortunate in the sense that most CEOs I've worked with are actually very open-minded. I think that's a trait that tends to allow people to get to the top. But certain teams might not be open to implementing certain things. And so there is a lot of politics that sort of creates bureaucracy as you go along in terms of selling and getting buy-in. Comes with the territory,
Mhm.
that some people are a little bit more difficult than others. And
Mhm.
ultimately, if somebody doesn't want to partner with you, it makes your life a lot more difficult.
Mhm.
I think the second component is the last few years in the tech and startup space have been tricky. Finance and venture capital have not been at their top, and companies have had series of layoffs and downsizing and restructuring. Relationships in business are known, well, they are different, but they're not completely different from personal relationships. Someone who's been through a few bad breakups or divorces or, tumultuous changes like that is less likely to easily trust the next relationship they get into. And I think rebuilding culture in environments where people may have felt that they experienced dishonesty or a lack of transparency and have, been a part of the organization growing. This happens a lot in startups where they felt that they were invested beginning and watched the organization develop, and then all of a sudden something big changed and people who were there from the beginning left. It's hard to rebuild that same level of excitement and trust. Sometimes it's nearly impossible. Nothing is impossible. But sometimes people have been through so much of a negative experience due to changes that are often not anybody's control that they really aren't ready or capable of rebuilding their faith in an
Mhm.
organization. I think this is the exception rather than the norm that it
Is
happens.
is there a healing process? I guess it takes time when changes happen. I'm imagining there's a healing process. There's a there's an energy dip within the org or within the team. Um, have you seen pan out over time?
There are many healing processes, and I think they're dependent on each organization. But one thing or two things that always work and need to be a part of it are transparency and acknowledgement of the pain that's an organization that, let's say, has gone through major reductions in force, as an example, have gone through. I think there's a often
Key.
well-intentioned but tone-deaf instinct from some leaders to just kind of come into an organization like that and say, what happened happened, we're moving on. Let's focus on the future. And
Hmm.
then, again, the thought process there is let's focus on the future. Let's not get mulled down in things that are depressing and negative. But people need to process things. And in addition to needing to process things, they also don't like to be made to feel as though they're feeling survivor's guilt or concern or watching, getting a demotion, for example, because of downsizing. And those things are not
Yeah,
valid. Yeah.
yeah. I think that that's interesting. I've sometimes fallen into that bucket of let's move forward and
Yeah.
realize that hey, we need to process this as a team or as a colleague, as a team. It's a very good point that you're making. It's the CEO wants to drive forward, but I think as a sharp CEO recognizes this, or a sharp leader, manager, colleague. Awesome. So, and how have you measured the impacts of the efficacy of sort of of how do you measure the success of of the changes or of the culture of the culture building that's happening?
There's a number of ways. And I think a
And
measure
what's
of
your favorite
productivity.
metric? Awesome.
My favorite is to use employment engagement surveys. That typically the main sort of highest level, like if you're summarizing the results and the first slide is going to have your employee net promoter score, which is calculated very similar to a customer net promoter score, as well as your engagement score, your engagement being how emotionally invested somebody, in simple terms, in the organization. And there are other things that are typically measured as well, like faith in management, leadership, and the mission, things of that nature. I think that's the most quantifiable way to do it, and it's the most benchmark friendly way to measure things. Um, Quantitative data over qualitative data 9 times out of 10, even in HR. I'll die on that hill.
Tell me more about that. Tell me about the net promoter score, just for those that may not be as familiar with that. Break that down
Mm-hmm.
into simple terms and talk about
Mm-hmm.
what you mean by quantitative to qualitative to break it
Sure.
simplify.
Net promoter scores are typically used with customers who've engaged in a business's services or goods, and you're asked on a scale of 1 to 10, usually some iteration of the question, how likely are you to recommend us? And I'm going to get the exact numbers incorrect here because I'm going by memory, but I think 1 through 6 or 1 through 5 is a negative score, which means you're a detractor, which means you're most likely to tell somebody, hey, I wouldn't even bother, using this company. So you're negative. The middle, which is either 5 through 8 or 6 through 8, is considered neutral, meaning you're not going to have strong opinions in either direction. So it's not factored into the score. And then 9s and 10s are promoters, people who are like, hey, Adam, have you checked out Allbirds shoes, for example? You'd really love that. And, now I'm helping to promote, almost market for Allbirds or for any other company. Allbirds sponsor me.
Although I have to say, the shoe it's
Yeah.
changed. I don't know. There's changes happening. I just got a pair of the what's the one with the bamboo fabric? I forgot the name of it.
Tree
The
runners,
tree
I
runner.
think they call them,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's a different fit. I got the 10s and different fit. I got to talk to them.
Allbirds reinvest in your quality assurance team and then sponsor me. So, so ENPSs, or Employee Net Promoter Scores, ask the same question and try to get the same sort of metric there. And that question is, how likely are you to recommend this as a place to work? What I mean in terms of quality over quantity, or quantitative over qualitative, I can illustrate in an example. Whenever you do a survey for employees, they're usually, let's say you have an organization with 100 employees, they'll answer 30 to 40 questions, which tracks out as these different sort of scores in different areas and measurements, whether it's engagement, communication, leadership, what have you, that you can compare across different teams and benchmarks. And then with each question that an employee fills out on their questionnaire, or their survey rather, there might be the opportunity to leave a comment. And a less experienced HR leader, when they present to an executive team, they might have the comments right up there on the first slide, and they might be very, very controversial comments like, I've hated my time at XYZ company because the workplace culture is toxic and I can't stand the CEO. But then the quantitative data, which comes from 99 other employees, might completely contradict the comment. And we're emotional creatures. So we might focus in on this comment that comes from one person. That person may be the exception, the minority rather than the majority.
Yeah.
But we get drawn into the qualitative metric, the comment, which is really meant in correct practice to be context to understand the more meaningful qualitative score. Simply put, quantitative score, quantitative scores reflect larger numbers of people. Qualitative,
statistically, there's statistical significance of the data.
correct.
Stuff. Yeah.
Exactly.
At the end of the day, is it both? But I mean, I feel like you have to. There's what we put on paper. There's what we say, and there's what we do. And that's what you're highlighting right there. It's what we say. It's how we're on average or in mass how we're thinking, and how are we acting also. How do you measure that? How are we actually? We say this. Is there ways to measure sort of? Is there another dimension there? Like how do you get, like, how is the teams actually performing?
There are direct ways to measure, for example, if we're walking the walk, if we're upholding our values or our norms or our principles in terms of how we act at the team level or at the organizational level. And one of the ways to most directly to do that is to include it in your survey. Do we practice what we preach here? Are we true to our mission? And I think that's a powerful thing that shouldn't be pushed to the side. But in addition, like I mentioned with developing your mission and your values or iterating on them, involving interested employees who want to be there in focus groups, if you have the time and resources, in addition to larger initiatives like surveys, is another powerful way that you can ask those questions and get qualitative feedback to inform the quantitative feedback through having these conversations with people who are oftentimes your most engaged, your most passionate. I think indirect measurements, turnover rates divided by team, performance metrics, performance reviews, average performance reviews, especially if they're 360 or bi-directional reviews by a team, oftentimes indicate a problem. And you could generally make a safe assumption, although we all know the saying about assuming, that a manager or a team that has a high rate of turnover might not be sticking to the mission and values of the company. But it might also just be that maybe they've done this is more unlikely, but maybe they've done such a good job that everybody's grown and they've been eaten up by other companies because their careers have prospered so much. So they're indirect measurements. You always have to understand when something's not directly measuring, it's hinging at something. And that usually is an indicator that you need to take a microscope or a magnifying glass and pry deeper, as opposed to directly asking people through a survey, through focus groups, oh, hey, what are we doing well, dear? What are we not, really being authentic about?
Mm-hmm. Have you had scenarios where performance is really great, but on the HR score or the NPS score is not great? Or is there usually a one-to-one correlation? If NPS is good, any sort of anecdotal experience on or thoughts on that?
Organizationally, I haven't. I've had that happen on certain teams. And typically where I've seen that is a team that is in a company that financially is not doing well. And that team, whether it's the finance team or the sales team, has a better understanding because by virtue of being market facing or finance facing, that regardless of how positive the culture might be and how good they might be performing in terms of what their individual performance goals are, they still realize that the reality is larger and maybe the market is just not buying the product. And so that's reflected in their overall sort of sentiment about the future, which sometimes influences the NPS score.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Okay. Cool. So big AI and human resources.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on AI, human resources, organizational culture? Where are we going? We have chatbots now that are getting smarter. Um, there's more information now that's in ChatGPT and Gemini and Cloud is another one. There's these tools out there where people can have rich access to information. Some companies also, there's a trend that like building internal chatbots or internal sort of AI companies
Mhm.
data plugged into these AI tools. Where do you think we're going? What do you think in the context of HR and culture? What do you think
I'm
as of
far.
today, October, it's May 24th, 2024.
My disclaimer would be that I'm far from an expert, and I've historically, coming around to it. You know this from knowing me. I've been a little bit resistant to things like using ChatGPT for the same reason. Sometimes I don't like to use my GPS when I drive because I want to maintain my sense of direction. I don't always use ChatGPT. I don't ever use it to write things because I want to remain a writer, and that's me. It's different based on people. I think one thing to mention is I don't think AI. I'm not a doom and gloom person. AI is not coming for your jobs. There are myths out there that, well, for HR jobs, I would say I don't think it's coming for it. There are myths out there now that AI has revolutionized the way applicant tracking systems find talent, for example. And so you need to pay, by the way, this person who's the first one to sound the alarm. They also have the solution. You need to pay this person to redo your resume with the right buzzwords, get past AI. That's all total BS. It's not something that we've reached. It's not something I think we will reach. I think ultimately AI fits into the category of better shoes while you run. Tools that we can use to be more efficient. So if you are somebody who struggles with writing emails that are effective, all right, put the inputs in, have ChatGPT help you write a more effective email. Try to reread it and learn from it so you can also see what ChatGPT did. Um, but that could be a time saver for you and free up more of the thought space that you need to be ideating and thinking strategically. So I think that we've
It's
only
going to be
scratched
shoes.
this.
It's going to be the word you use. It's going to be like
A tool.
a tool. Like you
Yeah.
mentioned running again there,
Mhm.
which is great. But it's sort of like a new set of shoes. It's like the Jordans I don't know if those really improve your performance, but it's a newer technology to help you perform better at what you're already
Yeah.
doing. Yeah, but you're the
Generally,
locomotive. The human is the locomotive. Is the driver.
generally speaking, with the exception of things like self-driving cars, right, that are becoming or in development are becoming a thing, but that's to the side, most tools need a person operating them. A hammer was created so somebody could, it could be an extension of their arm.
Yeah.
Computers were created so somebody can punch information into them and the computer can process it. AI is a tool. There needs, in my opinion, ideally there's a person driving it and it's making their life easier. Technology expands our limitations as people, but I don't think it's replacing us. Not yet.
Yeah.
I don't think so.
I'm a I'm a fan of your approach there. humans driving it. I think they're certainly going to be smarter than humans. So I mean, I follow technology just from the outside, but just from what I'm hearing, it's kind of common knowledge. It's quite advanced, and it will surpass human intelligence in terms of its ability to draw upon information, make logical conclusions. It's going to take humans to regulate this, and this is a whole nother sort of topic. But I think that should remain in companies and in culture. It's culture is a human component. It's going to take some regulation. I think in the coming years, in the next 5 years, we're gonna. I think as you mentioned earlier in the call, it's a change. The space is changing. What big companies need are changing. What AI is going to do for a smaller company, we can now act. A team of 10 can really be like a team of, I don't know. It's going to be some sort of a multiplier, times two, times three. It's going to create a lot of efficiency for people. It's going to be better running shoes, or it's going to be more advanced technology. We're still driving it, but we can go faster faster, exerting the same amount of energy.
Hmm.
So, it'll be interesting where that goes in the coming years.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
Has there been any book or material that's influenced you, most, profoundly influenced you? You're thinking about management and leadership.
The stuff.
Stephen Covey.
Stephen Covey's The Seven. I even have the accompanying card
It's a great
deck.
book. That's a great book. Tell me why. What do you love about that book? And at what point in your life or in your career did that sort of come on your desk?
When I worked in Oak Street Health, I partnered with their talent development team that was run by an organizational psychologist, two of them actually. And I guess they thought that I was good at public speaking. I don't know why, but they invited me to
You
teach a
are.
few of their. Thank
You
you.
are.
I appreciate it. I promise I wasn't fishing for compliments. They invited me to teach a few of their courses. And again, teaching helps you learn, but those courses included how to better manage yourself and how to be more efficient in really time management and task prioritization. And that's where I was introduced to a lot of concepts that ultimately linked back to Stephen Covey, who himself was a very influential rather, organizational psychologist, and
What's
who
your favorite
developed
one?
these. My favorite tool?
Yeah, from him.
I would say the Eisenhower Matrix. You know what it is.
No, 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 I'm sorry. From
Um,
Stephen Covey.
hmm?
What's your favorite? I guess favorite concepts from the the seven highly effective
My
habits.
favorite
Yeah.
rules of the two rules, I think beginning with the end in mind, which is if it's not rule number one, I think it's rule number two. And that is specifically about making sure that before you start a project, you take the time, which seems, self-evident, but it's often overlooked. You take the time to define what your end result is. What is your goal? Kind of like a vision, similar to OKR framework. What is your objective? Making sure that's well understood in high detail and in high fidelity, and then working backwards on finding the steps that will lead you there, as opposed to like sitting down to write a novel without knowing what the ending is first, if that makes sense. That's one concept.
Love that.
I think is the last rule, which is sharpening the saw, is also my favorite. I think it's called sharpening the saw, something
That's
along those
it.
lines.
Yeah.
Making sure that this goes back to work-life balance. I could be a really, really good HR leader, sales leader, marketing leader, whatever. If I'm not socializing and if I'm not going to the gym and eating healthy and sleeping at night, all of these things are going to affect me. I could have the most powerful sports car with the best tires on it. If I don't change the oil every so often, the car is going to be affected. Right?
Love that.
Everything works
Love that.
together.
Yep.
So
Love that. Taking your mind, body, replenishing ourselves.
yeah, there's this concept that is becoming more popular that we should be kind to ourselves. And I think that's a good concept. It's a healthy concept. Some people might say, it's some new age stuff. It's not for me. And to those people, I would say, okay, if that's not a good enough reason for you to take time for yourself, also recognize that scientifically, statistically, doing it actually makes you better at the work that you do. So if you poo-poo the idea of just being nice to yourself because you should enjoy life and be healthy, and it's not just in the physical sense, okay, but it still makes you better at the things that are important to you.